The Landing of the Pilgrims by James Doherty. Part 3, New England Adventure, 1621 to 1623. The Return of the Mayflower, March to April 1621. Through the winter, the weather-beaten Mayflower had served as a base while the Pilgrims worked ashore on their houses and shelters. When the common house burned, the ship was a refuge for the homeless. In the first sickness, it had served as a hospital. In case of Indian attack, they looked to it for safety. Now April was at hand, and the surviving sailors were strong enough to work the ship on her long voyage back to England. With the Mayflower gone, the little settlement would be left without this island of safety, this last link to home. A cannon shot from the ship sounded across the harbor. It was the signal for the ship's departure. 51 gaunt men, women, and children crowded to the shore where the ship's longboat waited. Captain Jones said the wind and tide were right. The hour had come to sail. For the last time, he offered to take aboard any who wished to return. No one answered. For many months, the captain had lived with these people and had learned the stuff they were made of. He was not surprised. He put their letters and packages in his leather bag. Bidding them all farewell, he returned to the ship. Those left behind stood in silent little groups at the water's edge, their gaze fixed on the bright speck of sail fading on the horizon. At this moment, their hearts were in old England in the sweet springtime. As the Mayflower disappeared, they turned back to the rugged New England hillside. Each one knew that a greater gulf than the Atlantic separated them forever from the past. All through that spring, both men and women worked daily in the fields and woods from dawn to dusk. Even their Governor Carver did the same hard labor as the rest. On a warm April day, while working in the fields, he was taken suddenly ill and lost consciousness. In a few days, he died. The colonists met and chose William Bradford for governor. Bradford bravely took up the task and did his work well. For nearly 35 years, he served as governor of New Plymouth. On his shoulders now rested the success of the colony. He made the rules, administered justice, divided the common store of provisions, and each year allotted shares of the common land to each of the families. He also supervised the Indian trade and dealt with strangers according to their deserts. Because Bradford was still weak from the first sickness, Mr. Allerton was chosen as his assistant. How Mr. Winslow brought a scarlet coat to Massasoit, and of their strange entertainment by that great Sagamore. July 1621. Mrs. Hopkins was bending over the open fireplace. She was extracting a corn pudding from the pot that hung over the fire. This New England dish, which she herself had invented, was made of Indian corn and deer fat, with whatever seasoning happened to be at hand. An uneasy feeling caused her to look around suddenly. "Wahoo!" she yelled, dropping the pudding in the ashes. In the room stood a tall, half-naked Indian making the peace sign. Behind him was a black-eyed woman and two very naked little boys. The Indian grinned, making friendly gestures. "Lord, I never can get used to 'em," Mrs. Hopkins said, shaking her head, but making a kindly sign toward her visitors. "The way they creep up on you without making a sound. It's enough to scare the life out of a body. Thank the Lord they don't mean no harm." The Indians were examining everything in the room. Mrs. Hopkins rescued the corn pudding from the ashes. "Here, taste this and be gone," she said as she distributed slices of the pudding to her visitors and shooed them laughingly out of the door. "I've no time to waste this morning." Little by little, the people of Plymouth were getting used to such visits. Singly or in groups, Indian visitors came out of the forest. Sometimes a dozen at a time came with their women, children, and dogs. They arrived at all hours of the day to sit and talk, to trade, to smoke, and eat. The English had little food or time to spare, and the Indians expected to be fed and entertained. These amiable visitors often interrupted work or wasted time, and sometimes became pests and nuisances. Squanto alone always made himself useful. In fact, he had become necessary in many different ways. Above all, he was the tongue of the English. He became their official interpreter and lived in Plymouth. When the planting was finished, Governor Bradford and his council decided that it would be in the interests of peace and good business to return Massasoit's visits. Winslow was appointed as their ambassador to the great chief. He would take with him Squanto as a guide and interpreter, and John Hopkins, who was a very good shot. They would, of course, take along a present worthy of the great chief. A scarlet coat trimmed in lace is a vanity, observed the governor, as he took the cotton hunting coat from the oaken chest and handed it to Winslow. But methinks it will delight the heart of our new friend, Chief Massasoit. Remind him of our deep love and of our desire that he bring many more of the skins of the beaver to trade for mirrors and iron kettles. Explain kindly how we wish that his people would come less often to visit us, but assure him that his royal person will always be welcome. Beseech him that he search out those from whom we took their corn, that we may restore the same to them in full measure. They started at sunrise, marching steadily through the green woods in single file behind the silent Squanto. In the middle of the afternoon, they sighted the smoke of a campfire and came upon a band of Indians in an open cornfield. Squanto said they were a tribe called Namashooks. These Indians invited the English to eat with them. The hungry white men feasted on large helpings of cornbread and shad roe. This last novelty was the most delicious Indian food they had yet tasted. Suddenly, the Indians pointed excitedly to where a flock of crows was alighting in their field of young corn. They want you to shoot at the crows, which are damaging their crops, Squanto explained. Obligingly, Hopkins rested the heavy musket on the firing staff and took aim. "Make sure you bring down a black thief," whispered Winslow. The second the shot resounded across the clearing, and the crows rose, cawing with a great flapping of wings. The Indians ran and picked up a dead crow, amazed at the magic powers of the white hunter. Squanto urged that the party push on while it was still light. After an 8-mile march, they came upon a fair river where there were Indians catching fish. They had made a fine catch of bass. That night, the English and Indians feasted on fish, fresh from the river. Then they slept under the stars, for the Indians had built no lodges there. When Squanto and the Englishmen started off the next morning, 6 tall braves accompanied them. During the long, hot day's march, the Indians carried the Englishmen's guns and baggage for them and took them over streams on their backs. The English admired the many kinds of fine trees as they marched through the forests. In places, they crossed rough outcroppings of rock. Once or twice, the party met an Indian and his family and stopped to trade trinkets for food. Along the rivers were the barren cornfields. These had been cultivated a few years before by a numerous tribe which had been wiped out by the plague. Winslow and his men came upon their skulls and bones lying in the underbrush. Late in the day, the party came out on a river, and Squanto pointed to where a village of round lodges straggled along the riverbank. "Here, Massasoit and his people dwell," said Squanto. Curious Indians surrounded the newcomers. When it was discovered that Massasoit was not there, a messenger was sent to notify him of Winslow's arrival. Squanto urged that when Massasoit came, the English should fire their muskets in his honor. The chief was considerably startled by the salute, and most of his people vanished into the woods. He was vastly pleased, however, when his visitors put the scarlet coat on his shoulders and a copper chain about his neck. He strutted about the village before his admiring subjects. When he tired of this, Massasoit made a solemn speech, saying he agreed to all that the English desired. He would give them new varieties of seed corn. He asked only that they destroy his enemies, the terrible Narragansetts. After the speech, he explained that he could not offer supper to his English visitors, as he had procured no food, but he invited them to sleep in his lodge. Then, for entertainment, the tribe sang and danced till late in the night, while the hungry white men slapped at the mosquitoes. That night in the chief's lodge, they shared the hard-board bed with Massasoit and his wife. 2 more huge Indians crowded in beside them. The night was sultry, and the lodge full of hungry fleas. "We were worse weary of our lodging than of our journey," said Winslow. Next day, the village was crowded with curious braves, their women, children, and dogs. They came for their first look at white men. Massasoit proudly paraded in his red coat. The Indians begged the white men to shoot at a mark. Hopkins blazed away at a dead tree with a charge of bird shot. The braves were amazed and puzzled to find the tree full of holes. Later, for supper, Massasoit brought in 2 large fish he had shot with his bow and arrows, but these did not go far among 40 Indians. Their chief amusement was gambling, and they wagered with one another for skins and knives. The Englishmen spent another miserable night fighting fleas and mosquitoes in Massasoit's lodge. Although the chief begged them to stay, they left at dawn the next morning. They had eaten only a little fish in 2 nights and a day, and had had hardly any sleep. They were glad to be returning to Plymouth. Of a black sheep, and of a strayed lamb, and of how Squanto was avenged. August 1621. The Billingtons had been shuffled into the Mayflower Company at London and were one of the profanest families in Plymouth. John Billington had refused to obey the orders of Captain Standish and had used some very bad language. As a punishment, he had been forced to spend a number of unpleasant hours on public display, with his neck and his heels tied together. His 2 sons, John and Francis, were a wild and vagrant pair. Francis had gone into the gunroom of the Mayflower as she lay in Provincetown Harbor and had found a loaded musket, which he fired off. As there were powder barrels about and one was open, it was a miracle that the ship had not been blown out of the water. Later in Plymouth, the boys had been strictly forbidden to go to the woods. Of course, Francis took the very first opportunity to explore the forest. From the top of a high hill where he had climbed a tree, he caught a glimpse of shining waters in the west. When he returned, he reported he had seen the Western Ocean. He and one of the sailors went inland for 3 miles and found the ocean to be 2 large freshwater lakes, out of which flowed the town brook. The lakes were full of fish and wildfowl. Folks said that Francis had made a valuable discovery. The lakes were called Billington's Sea. Again, the Billingtons stirred up Plymouth. John Jr. disappeared in the forest. It was rumored that he had been stolen by Indians. At first, some people said they felt sorry for the Indians, but after 5 days, the village was very alarmed. A lost child was everybody's business, and a search party was organized. 10 of the stoutest men went down the Cape in the ship to search among the Indians. After a heavy storm, they put in for the night at Coomagee Harbor, Barnstable Harbor. The next morning, the boat was left aground at low tide. Shoreward, the searchers could see a party of Indians hunting for lobster. From them, they learned through Squanto that John Jr. was safe among the Indians at Nauset, Eastham. The braves invited them ashore to share their lobster breakfast and took them to their chief, Sachem, whose name was Ivanov. He was the handsomest and most courteous Indian the Pilgrims had ever met. As the Indians crowded around them, an old woman pushed forward to see the white men. She was so withered and wrinkled that they took her to be at least 100 years old. She tottered forward and peered closely in their faces. Suddenly she burst into a loud wailing and began weeping bitterly. After the hubbub had quieted somewhat, Squanto explained that the old woman had once had 3 sons. They had gone aboard Hunt's trading vessel and had been carried off and sold in Spain, even as Squanto himself had been. Ever since, the mother had grieved, for she knew she would never see them again. Captain Standish said, "Hunt is a bad man of whom the English are ashamed. We would not do such a thing for all the furs in the country." He tried to comfort the poor woman with some trinkets, which seemed to please her. There was now hope that they would soon find young Billington alive among the Indians. It was again low tide when they reached Nauset. Darkness prevented them from entering the harbor, so Squanto and Ivanov were sent with a message to Aspinet, sachem of Nauset, saying that the English had come to seek the lost boy. Soon a band of the Nauset Indians came down to the shore and waded out to the grounded shallop. They urged the English to bring the boat ashore. Captain Standish suddenly realized that these were the same Indians who had attacked them at the place of the first encounter. "Stand ready to fire," he ordered. Then, turning to Squanto, the captain went on, "Squanto, tell them that only the Indians whose corn we have taken may come aboard." Squanto explained to the 2 tall warriors who came aboard that the English wished to pay them for their corn. They would bring them the corn, or the Indians could come to Patuxet, Plymouth, for it. The braves said they would like to come to Patuxet. More Indians surrounded the shallop. Aspinett, with 50 unarmed warriors, had now joined them, and behind him were 50 more waiting with their arrows on their bowstrings. At this moment, John Billington, Jr. arrived on the scene, perched triumphantly on the shoulders of a huge Indian. He was decked in feathers and necklaces of wampum and was having a wonderful time. The boy was restored to his father. The Indian who had taken charge of him while he was a captive among them was given a knife. A few trinkets to Aspinett restored peace. Sitting about the campfire, the boy told of his adventures among the Indians. He had had a good time with the Indian children and was well treated. He would be the hero of the hour in Plymouth when they returned. No wonder he was so pleased with himself. Squanto returned to camp from the Nausetts with alarming news. He had heard that the terrible Narragansetts were on the warpath. Massasoit had been captured and some of his people killed. Plymouth was in danger, with only 22 men to defend her. Standish decided to return to the threatened settlement at once, for it was a 48-hour journey by sea. The wind was contrary, but they started back without further delay. After a rough voyage, they came to Plymouth at last and found all things well. An Indian named Hobomok came running in from the woods with more alarming news. He and Squanto had gone in search of their chief, Massasoit. They learned that he had been betrayed by one of his sachems, named Corbitant. This Indian was stirring up Massasoit's own people in revolt against him and was speaking against the English. Corbitant had taken Hobomok and Squanto prisoner, but Hobomok had managed to escape. The last he had seen of Squanto, he was being threatened by Corbitant with his knife. Corbitant had said that if Squanto were dead, the English would lose their tongue. Hobomok was sure that by this time Squanto had been killed. Captain Standish determined this insolence must be punished at once. If Squanto were dead, he must be avenged. At the head of his army of 10 musketeers, Standish started out for Corbitant's village. All day Standish and his men marched in the rain. At nightfall, Hobomok said they were approaching the Indian village. They halted for supper, left their heavy knapsacks behind, and advanced stealthily through the darkness. Pressing on, they surrounded the village. Standish burst into Corbitant's lodge with his drawn sword, shouting, "Let no one move till we have taken Corbitant." Several Indians who attempted to escape were wounded in the scuffle. The soldiers fired their muskets. The whole town was in an uproar. The Indian women surrounded Hobomok and hung on his neck, seeking protection and calling him Tuwam, or friend. Seeing that the women were being spared, the Indian boys began crying out that they were girls. Captain Standish was told that Squanto was still alive. He ordered the campfires to be lighted and the lodges searched. Hobomok climbed atop a lodge and began calling for Squanto. He suddenly appeared in the circle of firelight. All the Indians then were disarmed. In the morning it was found that Corbitant and his warriors were not there. The Indians were told that the English intended to destroy only Corbitant and would punish any who should attack Squanto or Massasoit. The party then marched home with Squanto. Several friendly Indians followed with the baggage. 3 wounded Indians were brought back with them for treatment. So that, by God's good providence, we safely returned home the morrow night after we set forth. It had been a wild night of shouting and drawn swords and the gleam of armor against the darkness of the forest. Fortunately, no one had been seriously hurt. Although Corbitant had not been captured or punished, the power of the fiery little captain and his army had struck terror into the hearts of the Indians. Of the arrival of the ship Fortune, November 1621. It was almost a year to a day from the time that the Mayflower had anchored in Cape Cod Bay. 7 houses stood on the hillside overlooking Plymouth Harbor, and more were being built. The common storehouse was full of corn. The Pilgrims had fought starvation and won. No Indian attacks had been made on them from the threatening forests. By God's grace, the savages were their friends. For all this, there was a price. Half of their company lay in unmarked graves. Each day they must labor and watch by night against hunger and danger. Each day for a year their tired eyes had watched the naked horizon, and never a sail had come to bring them the promised supplies. Had they been utterly forgotten? Was there still an England? Suddenly, a cannon shot signaled the workers in from the woods and clearings. A sail on the horizon. Soon an English ship had anchored in the harbor. All Plymouth was at the water's edge to greet the men who stepped from the longboat. Their friend, Mr. Cushman, had come in the ship Fortune, bringing 35 lusty young men. Some were members of the Leyden Church. All were good workers for the fields and soldiers for defense. They were given welcome and then eager attention as they told news of home and friends. Mr. Cushman delivered his letters to the governor. It appeared that the Fortune had brought no supplies, not so much as a barrel of flour. The letter from the merchant adventurers was full of reproaches. The Mayflower had been sent back empty to England. The company would lose money. I know your weakness was the cause of it, and I believe more weakness of judgment than weakness of hand, said the letter. The Fortune must bring back a profitable cargo, or the adventurers might not invest further in Plymouth Plantation. A new contract was enclosed for the signatures of the colonists. In it, they practically bound themselves to slavery to the adventurers for 7 years. Reluctantly, they signed it. In 2 weeks, the Fortune sailed for England with a cargo of clapboard and 2 hogsheads of beaver skins. This fur was unknown in England and had been first brought to Plymouth by Squanto. As the Fortune's sails faded on the horizon, the colonists turned back to their labor. It seemed that the Fortune was a name that mocked their hopes of supply and comfort from England. Of the strange message from Canonicus and their bold reply. An Indian runner had brought the strange token and departed as silently as he had come. The snake skin with its black and brown patterns lay on the table like an evil thing. The light glistened on its shining scales, and 6 arrows protruded from its gaping mouth. The thing had some meaning that boded no good. It had been sent to the Pilgrims by Canonicus, chief of the Narragansetts. At once Bradford sent for Squanto, Winslow, Brewster, Allerton, and Standish. Squanto told them that the snake skin meant that Canonicus planned war upon them. It was a message of defiance. The elders debated whether to ask for peace or answer in kind. Brewster contended they should send a message saying, "We would wish to have peace, but if you want war, we are ready." "Perhaps he will better understand this," said Bradford, snatching the arrows from the rattlesnake skin and filling it with powder and shot. When the rattlesnake skin was returned to Canonicus, he refused to accept or even touch it. He ordered it out of his sight, out of the village, out of his domain. "It is the terrible medicine with which the English destroy our people and take from us the land of our fathers," cried the terrified chieftain. The snake skin was refused by one odd chieftain after another until it was finally returned to Plymouth. Thanksgiving, 1621. In the spring rain and summer rain, the green stalks of the Indian corn grew tall. The firm ears became full and heavy, 2 and 3 on each stalk. The corn silk turned brown on the end of each ear, and every tall stalk waved its feathery tassels like an Indian chief. Under Squanto's guidance, the Pilgrims hoed and tended the cornhills through the hot summer days. Health and strength came back to the invalids, and no one was sick. The bay teemed with shad, cod, mackerel, and herring. Squanto showed the Pilgrims how to take lobsters and eels. He led them to where oyster and clam beds were most abundant. When the summer was done, the hard, golden ears of corn were reaped and stored. Now there was time to hunt in the forest. Flocks of fat wild turkeys trooped in the underbrush, and along the streams and marshes, huge flocks of geese and ducks prepared for their southward flight. The black bears ambled under the oak trees seeking acorns, and the deer browsed on the southern slopes among the birch and pine trees. In a single day, the hunters killed enough turkeys to last for a week. Gratefully they gathered on Sabbath days and sang praise to God for his goodness and mercy to the children of men. Now the forests were turning to the autumn splendor of red and gold. It was a time for a celebration, for a feast of rejoicing, for a day of thanksgiving. The 12 women of New Plymouth began great preparations. From the kitchens came the savory smell of roasting geese and turkey. An abundance of cornbread and hasty pudding was being prepared. Stewed eels, boiled lobsters, and juicy clam stews simmered over the fires. Before the feast, Squanto was sent with an invitation to Massasoit and his chiefs. On the appointed day, the chief appeared with 90 tall warriors. For a moment, there was consternation among the cooks. They were not prepared to feed 90 extra guests, but Massasoit took care of the difficulty by sending his hunters into the forest. They returned with 5 deer. The feast now became a barbecue, with juicy cuts of roast venison for all. There were shooting contests with bows and guns. The Plymouth Musketeers, under their captain, Miles Standish, put on a drill with drums and trumpets. In return, the Indians performed their tribal dances and chants for the amazed English. Everyone relaxed. There was laughter and clowning. The Indians were in no hurry to go home as long as the food held out, and the holiday making carried on for 3 days. Squanto and Samoset translated long speeches of friendship and goodwill. White men in red would keep the peace as long as the sun shone and the grass grew. There would be lean times and hard work aplenty in the days ahead, but it was a goodly country. Though the English still were strangers in it, this was, for them, the promised land. After the Thanksgiving feast, Plymouth settled down to its second winter. Daily, Governor Bradford parceled out to each one a ration of corn from the common store. Because there were 35 newcomers to feed, he had to cut the corn rations to half of what had been planned at harvest time. When the snow came, the hunters found no game in the bare woods. Each day the governor sent the axemen to the forest to cut wood for the fires that must be kept burning in Plymouth against the bitter cold. Christmas Day was no exception. That morning the newcomers came to the governor and explained it was against their conscience to work on Christmas Day. "Very well, until you learn better," said the governor as he marched off with the workers to the woods. When the workers came home at noon, they found some of the newcomers playing games in the street, some pitching ye-bar and some at stool ball and such like sports. The governor gathered up the gaming implements and dryly announced that it was against his conscience for some to play while others worked. Through the bleak winter months, the men soon learned that hard work was not a virtue in Plymouth. It was a necessity. In March, a meeting was called to plan the second spring planting. The governor divided up their common land and gave to each his lot, together with his share of the seed corn. This had been carefully saved from the common supply. It was now clear that they would not have enough food to last until the harvest. For weeks to come, they would again have to fight off starvation as best they could while they waited for the crops to ripen. Although Bradford's bold answer to Canonicus had discouraged the Narragansetts from making war, there was still danger. Standish pointed out that the little group of houses on the hill slope was unprotected. His plan was to build a log palisade to enclose the mount, as well as the town, down to the water's edge. Everybody agreed to the plan. Axemen felled the straight pine trunks, and others worked on the 6-foot-deep trench encircling the town. Within a month, the stout log palisade 12 feet high enclosed the town. At the corners were projecting bastions that commanded the sides. At sunset, the gates were closed and a guard kept watch during the night. Captain Standish was very proud of the new fortification. He proceeded to organize his fighting men into 4 companies, with a leader for each. Each soldier was assigned his post for defense in case of an attack or fire. From now on, the settlers slept more peacefully in their beds at night. Of a Strange Plot, Spring 1622. Miles Standish was not a captain to sit idly in the shelter of the new palisade. He decided they should let the Indians know that the English would not remain shut up in the town, fearfully waiting an attack. The captain would go forth boldly among them, for Plymouth was badly in need of provisions, and the Indians of Massachusetts were known to have much corn. The shallop was fitted out for this trip with trading goods, guns, and gunpowder. The captain and his 10 musketeers, together with Squanto and Hobomock, sailed out of the harbor for Massachusetts Bay. As they rounded the point called Gurnet's Nose, the wind died down. Standish threw out the anchor while the men got out their oars. Suddenly, a distant cannon shot sounded across the water, then another, and then a third. It was a signal from Plymouth telling them to come back. They loaded their muskets and rowed with all speed. At Plymouth, they found every man and boy standing at his post prepared for an Indian attack. Squanto's brother had come running into the town, his face covered with blood, to warn them that the Narragansetts, along with Corbitant and Massasoit, were on the way to attack the town. The Indians, he said, were close behind him. All night they stood watch. No Indians appeared. The messenger who brought the news had disappeared. It was a false alarm. Not long after, Hobomock came secretly to Standish, saying he knew that his chief Massasoit would not make war on the English. It was a plot by Squanto to turn the English against Massasoit. When Standish said he could not believe this of their faithful friend Squanto, Hobomok revealed that Squanto for a long time had been terrifying the Indians. It had been his boast that he had great power to influence the English to destroy the tribes. He had told them that the English kept the dreadful plague hidden in the ground. Only he could prevent them from loosing it on the Indians. Squanto was blackmailing the Indians and influencing them against Massasoit. To prove his story, Hobomok said he would send his wife secretly to Massasoit's village to discover whether he was plotting against the English. She came back with word from Massasoit that he always had and always would keep the peace treaty with his friends, the English. Squanto was a bad man and should die, Massasoit declared. At this news, Standish angrily told Squanto that he deserved death, but he realized the Indian was too valuable to the English as an interpreter to be killed. The expedition now set off again for Massachusetts and in a short time came back with a good supply of corn. On his return, Standish found Massasoit in Plymouth, angrily demanding that Squanto be killed for his treachery. In fact, Massasoit wanted to murder the traitor on the spot with his own axe. Bradford refused to surrender Squanto, saying that he was the tongue of the English. Without him, they would not be able to talk with the Indians. Massasoit left in a rage. A few days later, messengers came from the chief with Massasoit's knife. With it, the English should kill Squanto and send his severed head and hands to Massasoit. Squanto stood silently by, awaiting his fate. The Indians claimed that he was Massasoit's subject, and according to the peace treaty, must be turned over to them. At this moment, a cannon shot announced a sail on the horizon. The lookout reported that it appeared to be a pirate ship. The governor ordered everyone on the alert. Bradford told the Indians that they must await his decision about Squanto.